The floor of the house was thick with rushes, the way every floor was in that country, cut fresh from the river bank and scattered underfoot for warmth and for cleanliness, and it was from that floor, without thinking, that her hands began to gather. She had been sent for at first light. A servant had come running along the path from Kildare with the news that the old chieftain was dying, that the fever had turned in the night and taken his senses with it, that he thrashed and cried out and would not be still, and that his household, pagan to a man, pagan as their fathers before them, did not know what to do with a dying man who no longer knew his own name. They knew Brigid's name, though. Everyone in that country knew it. She was the woman from the great foundation at Kildare, who came when called, who did not ask first whether the household prayed to her God or to the old gods of well and hill, who came anyway, so she came. She sat at his bedside in that low, smoke-dark house with its rushes underfoot and its fire banked low in the centre, and she found a man past speech, his eyes open but seeing nothing she could reach, his hands plucking at the blanket as though trying to gather something that was not there. Around her the household stood in the kind of helpless half-circle that gathers around the dying, a wife, sons, a woman who might have been a sister, all of them watching the chieftain and watching Brigid by turns, waiting to see what a holy woman would do that a druid or a physician had not already tried. What she did was sit. And because her hands, like the hands of every woman who has ever kept a house or minded a sick room, could not stay idle in the presence of trouble, she reached down and gathered a fistful of the rushes from the floor beside her stool. She did not plan the cross. That is the first thing worth knowing about this story, and the thing every life of Naomi Brigid insists upon when it tells it. Her hands moved before her mind had given them an instruction, the way a woman's hands will move when she is anxious or praying, or simply keeping herself from the greater terror of watching a soul slip while she can do nothing else. She bent the green rushes double, she turned one across another. She folded and interlaced them the way her fingers had known how to do since she was a child, minding her mother's dairy, weaving without watching her own hands, because that is a skill that lives in the fingers and not in the thinking part of the mind at all, under and over. A centre where 4 arms met, and then each arm bent again at its own middle, so that what emerged was not a bundle of rushes any longer but a shape, 4-armed, wheeling, unmistakable even in that dim firelight. You have seen that shape. It is very likely hanging above your own door at this moment, tucked behind a picture frame or pressed dry and brittle into a missal, renewed every February when the rushes are cut again for Naomi Brigid. You have probably never wondered too hard about the first time it took shape, because it has always simply been there, the way the woman who made it has always simply been there, at the centre of every Irish home that has kept the faith. But somebody's hands had to make it first. Some evening, some rush floor, some pair of hands moving faster than a mind fully following them, and this is that evening, and those were the hands. The chieftain saw it before he heard anything of what it meant. That is how the story is kept in the tradition, and it is the detail worth sitting with the longest, because it tells you something about how Brigid brought the faith to people her whole life long. Not argument first, but a thing to look at. His wandering eyes came to rest, in the middle of his fever, on the small green shape turning in the woman's hands by the fire, and something in him, whatever part of a dying man's mind, still reaches for order when everything else has come loose, fixed on it. He grew quieter. His hands stopped plucking at the blanket, and when at last he found enough of himself to speak, it was not a prayer to the gods of his fathers that came out of him, and it was not a cry of fear. It was a question, small and plain, the kind of question a child asks. "What are you making?" She told him. This is the part of the story that every household in Ireland has carried forward for 1500 years, told to children at firesides, while the rushes for the next year's cross were still damp on the table, that Brigid held up what her hands had made, and explained it to him arm by arm. She told him of a man who had been nailed to a shape very like this one, arms spread wide, and who had died on it not because he was defeated, but because he had chosen it, freely, out of love for the very people who had put him there. She told him that this same man had not stayed dead. She told him, and here you can imagine the old chieftain's failing attention catching, the way a dying man's attention catches on the one thing in the room that still makes sense, that this man had risen, and that the shape in her hands was not a mark of his suffering only, but of a door standing open on the far side of it. He had spent his whole life, that old man, among the gods of well and hill and standing stone, the gods his people had prayed to since before anyone living could remember, and none of that had been taken from him roughly. Brigid did not come into that sick room to tell him his fathers had been wrong to believe what they believed. She came with rushes from his own floor, cut from the same riverbank his own household had always cut them from, and she showed him a new God, using the oldest, plainest materials the two of them had in common. This was her way, it would be her way for the whole of her life, at Kildare and beyond it, to meet a soul exactly where it stood, with what lay nearest to hand, rather than demand it travel toward her on unfamiliar ground. The fever had not lifted from him. He was still dying, in fact, within that same day, by the account the tradition has kept, but something in him had cleared enough to be afraid in a different way than he had been afraid an hour before. Not afraid of the dark closing in without meaning, but afraid, perhaps for the first time in a long life, of chieftainship and cattle and old certainties, that he might be about to meet whatever waited on the other side of that door unprepared. And so he asked her, this too the tradition has kept, plain as the rest of it, to baptize him before he died. There was no priest riding through that country that hour, no church near enough to reach in time, and a dying man does not wait on convenient arrangements. What there was water, kept in a vessel near the hearth the way it always was in every house in Ireland, for the ordinary business of living, and now pressed into the extraordinary business of dying well. Brigid took it up. She said over him what needed to be said, and the old chieftain, who had spent the whole of his life under gods of stone and well, and had never once in that life bent his head to the God of the cross, went out of the world a Christian, baptized at the last hour by a woman with wet fingers and a woven shape of green rushes still resting on the blanket beside him. Think what that must have been, for the household standing in the half-circle around the bed. They had watched their lord thrash in a fever that made no sense of the world, and they had watched a strange woman sit down among the rushes on the floor and do something with her hands that none of them could name, and they had watched their chieftain grow quiet under it and ask his question and receive his answer and go to his death in peace instead of terror. Whatever they had believed walking into that sick room, they had watched a man cross over into a new faith in the space of an afternoon, led there not by threat or argument, but by the simple, patient shape of a story told through rushes. It would be very strange if none of that household remembered it afterward. It would be stranger still if, in the years that followed, that shape did not begin to appear cut fresh and laid above the doors of houses all through that country, kept the way people keep the things that save someone they love. This is why the cross above your door is not simply an ornament, however dear, and not simply a custom kept because it has always been kept. It is the memory of a woman's hands moving faster than her words, at the bedside of a man whose name history did not think to preserve, but whose death the whole of Ireland has never stopped remembering. Every February, when the rushes are gathered fresh from wherever they can be found, a ditch, a riverbank, a garden left to grow wild in one corner for exactly this purpose, and woven again into the same four-armed shape by hands that may never have heard the whole story behind what they are making, something of that sick room is made present again. The weaving itself becomes a kind of prayer, whether or not the weaver knows to call it that, under and over, 4 arms from one centre, a shape simple enough for a dying man to understand in the space between one breath and the next, and rich enough that 15 centuries of Irish Christians have never exhausted what it holds. It is worth saying plainly, too, what this story tells you about the woman herself, because you will meet her many more times in the pages that follow, and it helps to have met her first exactly here, at a stranger's deathbed, rather than in some grander scene of foundation or miracle. Brigid did not go to that dying man armed with theology. She went with her hands ready to do whatever they were needed for, and when they found nothing better to do than gather rushes from a floor, they gathered rushes, and out of that plain, unplanned motion came a door through which an entire soul walked from one world into the next. That was always going to be her way, whether it was a leper she fed from her own bowl, or a king she outwaited at his own gate, or a community of women and men she gathered under one roof at Kildare in a shape the world had not seen attempted before. Brigid's holiness moved through her hands into whatever lay nearest, milk, bread, wool, rushes, water, and turned it, without fuss or grand announcement, into the means by which someone else was brought closer to God. The old chieftain died that same day, at peace, a Christian, in a house that had never held a Christian before, and the small green cross he had watched take shape in the firelight outlived him by a very great deal. It outlived the household that stood witness to it, and the country they lived in, and every generation since who has cut fresh rushes each February without quite being able to say why it must be done that particular way. Arm over arm, 4 points from one centre. It has outlived, in a manner of speaking, time itself, because it hangs today in more Irish homes than any single image of any single saint has ever hung, quietly keeping watch over thresholds the way it once kept watch over a dying man's last clear hour. That is who you are about to meet in the pages ahead, not a legend arriving fully formed with halo and title, but a woman whose hands moved before her words did, sitting on rushes in a dim house, making something out of nothing much because a stranger needed her to. Everything else you will learn of her, the mother who bore her into slavery, the father who tried to sell her cloak, the bishop who mistook her calling and ordained her anyway, the great flame she would one day kindle at Kildare and keep burning long after her own death. All of it grows out of exactly this: hands that could not stay still in the presence of someone else's need, and a faith patient enough to meet a dying man exactly where he lay. The night her mother's labour came upon her, Brocca was carrying water, and so it was on the threshold that now Brigid came into the world, 1 foot of the household inside the door, and 1 foot in the yard, the sky still black at the western edge and going grey with the first showing of dawn in the east. She was born neither in the house nor outside it. She was born, the old people always said, in between. There is a way of telling this story that makes it sound like an accident of timing, a servant woman caught mid-core by a baby who would not wait, and so it may have looked to anyone standing in that yard in Dubtak's fort before the sun came up, but the tradition has never let it rest at that. Nothing about the hour, the place, the mother's condition, or the child's first breath was accidental. Mary of the Gael was born on a threshold, because a threshold is what she would spend her whole life standing on, between one world and the next, between the old gods and the new God, between the free and the unfree, between Ireland as it had always been and Ireland as it was about to become. She could not have been born in the ordinary way, safely inside four walls, because there was nothing ordinary in her, not from the first cry. Her mother's name was Brocca, and Brocca was a slave. This is not a detail to soften or hurry past, and the tradition has never tried to hurry past it. Brocca had been baptised, some say by Patrick himself, in that first great wave of the faith sweeping over Ireland when the old religion still held every hill and well and grove, but the new religion was beginning, house by house, to take root. She was a Christian woman living inside a Druid's household, which is to say she carried one world folded inside the other, the way her daughter would be born, carrying two worlds folded inside her single small body. Brocca served in the household of Dubtak, a chieftain of Leinster, a man of standing and land and the old ways, a man who kept Druids at his table and paid the old religion its due in every season, and Dubtak was Brigid's father. There is no way to tell this part of the story gently, because there was nothing gentle in the arrangement itself. Dubtak's wife would not have Brocca under her roof once it became plain a child was coming, and so Brocca was sold while carrying Na Breed, sold to a Druid, a man learned in the old rites, keeper of the sacred fires and the sacred trees, a reader of omens in cloud and bird and flame. It is to this Druid's house, this house standing under Ireland's oldest religion, like a roof of oak leaves, that Brocca came to bear her daughter. And it is on the threshold of that house, in the grey hour before full light, that the child arrived, neither slave born in full disgrace, nor free born in full honour, neither of the fort she'd been carried from, nor entirely of the house she was carried to, neither fully within the household, nor fully outside it, between, always between. Ireland in those years, the middle of the 5th century, the young Christian faith spreading like a low fire through dry grass, Patrick himself perhaps still walking the roads and preaching at the raths. Ireland in those years was not two nations, one pagan and one Christian, sitting apart from each other with a clean line drawn between them. It was one Ireland, holding both often in the same household, sometimes in the same heart. Brocca's baptism did not free her from Dubtak's household gods. Dubtak's household gods did not stop him keeping a Christian slave, or later, as the stories tell, coming himself in some manner to reverence the God his daughter served with such fire that even a hard man like him could not entirely stand against her. The oaks were still standing all over that country, and men still swore oaths on them, still brought offerings to the wells that bore the names of older gods than Christ, still kept the turning of the year by the old festivals, Imbolc among them, the first stirring of spring, the day the ewes came into milk, sacred long before it was ever Brigid's day. That was the Ireland now Brid was born into. Oak dark is the old phrase for it, and rightly so, a country of deep groves where a Christian could kneel and a Druid could read the sky from the very same clearing, where the sacred was everywhere and nobody doubted it, only argued about which name it answered to. It is no wonder then that so much doubt has gathered over the exact year of her birth, and that even the great annals cannot agree, some placing it as early as 439, some as late as 456 or 457, a spread of near 20 years for so great a saint. The tradition holds the differing dates gently rather than forcing a false certainty on them, the way a family holds two versions of how the grandparents met, both told at different firesides, both true in their way, and nobody troubled enough by the small contradiction to make anybody choose. What the tradition has never wavered on, in any life, from Cogitosis onward through the Vita Prima and the Betu Brit, is the shape of the birth itself, the threshold, the dawn, the two worlds. The when of it was left soft. The how of it was kept sharp, kept exact, kept the same in telling after telling for 1500 years, because the how of it was the whole meaning. Fort is the place most given to her birth, a green rise of land near Dundalk in what is now County Louth, and to this day there is a well there that carries her name, and pilgrims still go to it, still tie their strips of cloth to the thorn tree that leans over it, still carry away a bottle of its water for a sick child or a hard childbirth of their own. Whether it was Fort exactly, or some other rath in that same country, the tradition is not troubled to swear an oath upon. What matters, what has always mattered, is that it was a place under Leinster sky, in a household split between the fort of a free chieftain and the dwelling of a bondswoman he'd sold away. in a country that had 1 foot in Newgrange and 1 foot in Rome without yet fully knowing which foot it meant to stand on. Brigid was born into that unresolved balance, and she never left it. She spent her whole life afterward standing exactly where she'd been born, between the mighty and the enslaved, between the old year and the new one, between what Ireland had been for 4,000 years and what it would become because of women and men like her. There is a story, and every child raised on the Lives has heard some version of it, that on the very morning of her birth, or very near it, the house where she lay, seemed to those who saw it to be on fire, flames rising from the roof, licking up into that grey dawn sky, and neighbours running with water, only to find, when they reached the door, no fire at all, no smoke, no mark of burning anywhere, only the infant lying quiet in her mother's arms. It is the first sign the tradition gives us of what she would be, though she had not yet opened her eyes to the world she'd come into. Fire that does not consume. Fire that announces itself and then withdraws, leaving no scar, asking nothing to be quenched because it was never truly burning anything at all, only showing itself for a moment to whoever had eyes to see. She would carry that same fire her whole life, the fire at Kildare that never went dark, the fire under her hands when she blessed the sick, and this first fire, unexplained and untroubling, over the roof where she drew her first breath. Nobody in that yard needed telling what it meant. They only needed to remember it, and thank God they did. Brigid's early years were passed the way a slave-born child's years were passed in that world, at her mother's side, in her mother's work, learning the labour of a bondswoman's hands before she learned much else. Brucha served the Druid's household in the dairy, by most tellings, among the milk and the churns and the great vats of butter that a household's wealth was measured by, and the little girl grew up in that dim, sweet-smelling world of milk work, a world entirely of women's hands and women's knowledge, passed down mother to daughter the way it had been passed down since Ireland was Ireland. It would mark her forever after, the woman who blessed the churns at Kildare, whose name to this day is still invoked over milk pails and butter crocks in farmhouses that have never forgotten her, learned that blessing first as a child too young to know she was learning anything at all, only watching her mother's hands move over the same vats, the same rhythm, morning and evening, world without end. But even as a small child, before she was old enough to be trusted with much responsibility at all, the tradition tells us something about her that unsettled the household from the very beginning, something that ran ahead of every lesson anyone tried to give her. She gave things away. Whatever came into her small hands, food set aside for her own meal, butter meant for the Druid's table, whatever store of anything she was set to mind for a moment, she gave it to whoever asked her for it, or even to whoever merely looked as though they might need it, without being asked at all. She could not seem to help it. It was not defiance, the way the Lives are always careful to tell it, not a child's rebellion against the people who owned her mother, and by extension owned her. It came from somewhere deeper than defiance, some well in her that filled up faster than any hoarding could keep pace with, so that whatever she was given to hold, she held it only for as long as it took to find someone with an empty hand nearby. The stories from these earliest years are small stories, homely stories, nothing like the grand miracles of her adult life at Kildare, and that smallness is exactly what makes them so dear to the tradition, why they've been kept and retold at firesides for 15 centuries when so much else about those childhood years has been let go. She gave away the butter she was meant to be churning and setting aside for the household store, gave it straight to a poor family who came begging at the door, and when the Druid or whoever kept the house discovered the crocks near empty, the child had no explanation to offer except the plain truth of what she'd done, and no apparent understanding of why it should be considered a fault. And more than once, so the Lives remember, when she had given away every last measure of the butter there was, and there was fear of the household going hungry or the reckoning falling hard on her mother for the loss. The butter was found restored, the crocks full again, full past what had ever been churned, as though the poverty her giving created could not be allowed to stand, as though whatever hand fills the world's stores had decided this particular child's excess of mercy was not going to be permitted to end in anyone's hunger, least of all her own households. It is worth sitting with that detail a moment, because it is the whole of her contained already in a girl too young to be trusted alone with a dairy. She did not calculate. She did not measure her giving against her own need, or her mother's standing in a hard household, or the risk of punishment that might follow. She saw an emptiness in front of her, a hungry hand, a bare table, and she moved to fill it with whatever was nearest her own hand, without pausing to ask whether it was hers to give. This was not a lesson she had been taught yet. Nobody had catechized this small child in Christian charity in any formal way that the Lives record. She had not yet, so far as we're told, been given over to any priest's instruction. It came out of her the way water comes out of a spring, not poured in from outside, but simply what was there already, rising, finding whatever crack in the ground would let it out into the world. And this is where the threshold of her birth returns, if you let it, and shows itself for what it truly was. She was born neither wholly inside the house nor wholly outside it, and she spent her childhood the very same way, inside the Druid's household by daily labour and by her mother's bondage, but never fully belonging to its keeping, never fully governed by its accounting of what was hers to hold and what was not. She gave away what belonged, by every worldly measure, to a master who was not her own, in a household that was not fully her home, because she had already understood, before anyone taught her the words for it, that nothing she held in her hands was truly hers to keep back from someone who needed it more. That is not a child's foolishness. It is very close to the whole of the gospel, arrived at by a girl years before she is recorded ever hearing it preached. The tradition does not explain how a child raised in a Druid's dairy came to such an understanding so early and so completely. It simply hands the stories down, one after another, small as they are, and lets them speak for what they plainly show, that Naum Brigid did not become the woman of Kildare's open door and endless bounty. She was born that way, on a threshold at first light, already giving away whatever she was given to hold, before anyone in that whole oak-dark, wonderful, half-Christian country could get near enough to stop her. By the time she was old enough to be sent from her mother's side, for the arrangement between Dubthach and the Druid did not last her whole childhood, and there is more of her story yet in how she came at last to her father's own household, and what happened there, and what she made happen there, in turn. She had already shown, in this small overlooked stretch of years, the lives pass over so quickly, the whole shape of the woman to come, born between two worlds, raised between two houses, and already, long before Kildare, long before the great cross woven by a dying man's bed, long before the perpetual flame was ever kindled, giving away everything she held, as though she already knew, the way only a saint knows things before she has words for them, that there would always, always be more. The storeroom at Dubthach's Rath was never full for long, not with Brigid keeping the keys. She was still a girl when the pattern set in, sent by her father to fetch butter for the household. She would come back with empty hands and a story about a leper at the gate, or a widow with nothing for her children, or an old man too weak to work his own land. The butter went, the bacon went. The measures of meal that were meant to last the household through Samhain went out the gate wrapped in cloth, carried by a girl who could not walk past hunger without feeding it. Dubthach was a man of standing in Leinster, a freeman with cattle and land and a name that meant something at the assemblies, and every week his daughter gave a little more of it away to people who had no claim on him at all, not kin, not fosterage, not the bonds of clientship that governed who owed what to whom in that world, just need. That was the only claim Brigid ever required. He shouted, he threatened, he set watchers on the storeroom door. None of it held. The girl found another way, always, because the fire in her did not answer to locks. And Dubthach, who loved her, the stories are clear that he loved her, fiercely, the way a proud man loves a daughter who embarrasses him precisely because she is nothing like him, began to feel that love curdling into something closer to despair. He had a household to run, he had a rank to maintain, and he had a daughter who seemed to regard his wealth as belonging, by right, to whoever needed it more than he did. It came to a head over the sword. Every man of Dubthach's standing kept a sword worthy of his name, and his was a fine one, jewelled at the hilt, the kind of blade that marked a household as one to be reckoned with. It hung in a place of honour, not a thing to be touched, let alone given away. But a leper came to the gate one day, while Brigid was minding the house alone, and the leper had nothing, and Brigid had nothing left in the storeroom to give him. She had already given it all, days before, and so she took down her father's sword, jewels and all, and pressed it into the poor man's hands, and sent him on his way rejoicing. When Dubthach came home and found the peg empty, something in him broke loose that had been building for years. This was not butter. This was not meal that would be replaced by next autumn's harvest. This was the sword of his rank, given to a beggar by a girl who did not seem to understand, or did not care, what it cost a man to be humiliated in front of his own household, in front of the neighbouring chieftains who would hear of it before the week was out. He had had enough. He decided he would be rid of her. He would take her to the King of Leinster and sell her. It tells you something about the age Brigid was born into, that this was even possible, that a father held that much power over a daughter, that a girl who gave bread to lepers could be loaded into a chariot and driven to market like a heifer. It tells you something else about Brigid, that she went without a fight, calm as still water, because she trusted, the way she always trusted, that whatever happened next was in better hands than her father's. He left her outside the king's dwelling with the chariot, and of all things, the sword, for he had recovered it, or had another made. The tradition does not linger on which, while he went in to strike his bargain. And while he was inside naming his price, a leper came to the chariot and begged. Brigid had nothing else to give him, so she gave him the sword. When Dubthach came out to fetch her, and found the sword gone again, his rage broke over her completely. He dragged her before the king, and poured out the whole complaint, the butter, the meal, the treasures given away one after another, to strangers who could offer nothing back, and now this, The second sword lost to the same foolishness, right there in the king's own yard, where every man present could see how a father's authority counted for nothing against his daughter's charity. He wanted the king to buy her, to take her off his hands, and let some other household absorb the loss. The King of Leinster looked at the girl a long moment. Then he looked at her father. He would not buy her, he said. Her merit was greater before God than either of theirs. A girl who could not keep her own father's sword because a beggar's need outweighed it in her eyes was not a servant to be priced and sold. She was something else entirely, something a king had no coin to purchase and no right to own. He sent them both away, the sword ungiven back, the bargain unstruck, and Dubtak went home with a daughter he could neither change nor be rid of. There is a story told too of the sword raised, of a moment when Dubtak's fury carried him past shouting, past threats of sale, to the very edge of violence. His hand went to the blade. He lifted it against her, this daughter who had cost him so dearly and shamed him so publicly, the anger of years arriving at its worst possible ending, and the sword came down again, unswung. Whatever stayed his arm, whether it was the plain sight of her face turned up to him without fear, or something larger moving through that yard the way it had moved through the king's, or simply a father's love proving stronger in the end than a father's pride, the blade never fell on her. He could rage at her, he could not destroy her. That distinction runs through every telling of Brigid's youth, like a seam of iron. The world could resist her, thwart her, sell her, threaten her, and none of it so much as singed the fire she carried. Dubtak's sword found beggars and kings and the edge of his own restraint, but it never found his daughter. After that, something in him gave way for good. He stopped trying to break her to his own purposes. What remained was the ordinary business of a father with a daughter of marriageable age, and here too Brigid gave him nothing to work with. Suitors came, and by every account there were suitors, for she was lovely, and her reputation for holiness had already begun to travel further than her father's storeroom, drawing men who wanted a wife of proven virtue as much as men who wanted a wife of proven beauty. Brigid wanted neither kind of wanting. She had given her whole self already, long before any suitor arrived at the gate, to a bridegroom no father could negotiate with, and no dowry could satisfy. She refused them one after another, gently by some accounts, immovably by all of them, until at last, so the old story goes, she prayed to be made unlovely. She asked God to take the beauty that kept drawing men to her door, to mark her face so plainly that no one would trouble her again with offers of marriage, so that she might belong to Christ alone without the whole world lining up to argue the point. Her prayer was answered, a blemish came over one eye, disfiguring what had been fair, and the suitors stopped coming. Whether we are meant to picture it exactly so, or to hear in it the shape of a deeper truth, that Brigid gave up, gladly, whatever currency the world set on a woman's face, the moment it stood between her and the life she wanted, either way the meaning does not change. She would not be bought with a sword's price by a king, and she would not be bought with a wedding's price by a husband. She had already decided, long before the world caught up with her decision, exactly whose she was. And so the road that had once run toward the King of Leinster's hall now ran toward a bishop. She travelled with companions, young women of like mind, drawn to her already, the first small gathering of what would one day be a whole community bound to her rule, north and west across Ireland, to where Bishop Mel kept his church, a nephew of Patrick himself, a man of the first Christian generation on Irish soil, still close enough to the apostle's own hand that ordaining a veil upon a new soul carried the weight of that whole unbroken chain. Brigid came to him asking what she had wanted since before her father ever raised a sword against a beggar's need, to be veiled, to be given wholly and formally and forever to the God she had never for one day belonged to anyone else. What happened at that veiling has been told and retold in every life of her that the faithful have kept, because no one who was there could tell it any other way and be telling the truth. Bishop Mel began the rite proper to a virgin taking the veil, the words the church had always used to consecrate a woman to religious life, words that bound her to God but left the governance of the church, the ordaining of priests, the authority of a bishop's see, in other hands entirely, as was the order of things. But as he read over her, something came upon him that was not his own doing. The words that left his mouth were not the words of the rite he had begun. He found himself speaking, instead the form used for consecrating a bishop. Gael, the companion bishop standing beside him, heard it and cried out in alarm. This was not lawful, this was not how it was done. A mistake had been made, and it must be corrected before it stood, before the whole church took note that a woman had been given, by whatever accident of the tongue, the very words that set a man apart to rule and to ordain. Bishop Mel would not take it back. He told Gael, and this has been treasured by the faithful ever since, word for word, as the moment the church itself recognised what heaven had already decided, that this had not been his error to correct. The Holy Spirit had spoken through him, not against his will but past it, and no bishop living had authority to unspeak what God had spoken. Brigid's virginity, he said, and her wisdom were such that this rank belonged to her alone among the women of Ireland. Let it stand. And there above her kneeling head, witnesses said, a pillar of fire rose up, visible to every soul gathered in that church, flame with no wood to feed it, and no hand to have lit it, standing over her like a mark set down by God himself on what Bishop Mel had just done. It did not burn her. It did not burn anything at all. It simply stood, blazing and silent, over the head of the girl who had spent her whole childhood giving away sword and meal and butter to whoever needed them more than her father did, and who had just been given in return an authority no woman in Ireland had held before her, and few would hold again. Think what you like of a father's sword raised and lowered, of a king who would not buy her, of a bishop whose tongue was taken out of his own hands for the length of a single rite. Every one of those moments says the same thing over and over in a different key. Dubtak's rage could scorch the household, could send his daughter to market like cattle, could very nearly in one terrible instant end her life by his own hand, and none of it could put out what burned in her. It only drove her, mile by mile and refusal by refusal, toward the one place that fire was always going to end up, consecrated, witnessed, set alight before the whole church in a flame no one had lit and no one could extinguish. She left Bishop Mel's church that day no longer merely her father's daughter, freed at last into being entirely what she had always, in truth, already been, God's own, without division, without a single portion of herself held back for anyone else to claim. The road behind her had a sword raised over it, and a sword lowered, and a king's refusal, and a father's long defeat. The road ahead of her had a green plain under a great oak tree, waiting for the day she would plant there a fire that this one, at her veiling, had only announced was coming. The King of Leinster kept her waiting most of the morning, which tells you something about the King of Leinster and nothing at all about the woman standing before his gate. She had walked from Uí Fallin with a small company of women, none of them armed with anything but purpose, to ask him for land, not gold, not cattle, not the tribute a chieftain might expect from a petitioner at his door. Land, a modest plot, she said, on the plain above the river Liffey, where the ground rose dry and green and a great oak stood alone against the sky, older than any man's memory of it. She wanted to build a church there, a house of prayer, a place where the poor could come and not be turned away, where the sick could be tended, where women could give their lives to Christ the way men had begun to do in the monasteries springing up across Ireland. The king laughed. Not unkindly, perhaps. Kings are often permitted to think their laughter kind. He looked at this woman in her plain mantle, this bishop's daughter born to a bondwoman, this small figure who had already given away half her father's household in acts of charity that should by rights have ruined him, and he made her an offer he thought cost him nothing. She could have, he said, as much ground as her cloak would cover. It was the kind of joke a powerful man makes to be rid of a petitioner without the discourtesy of a flat refusal. Everyone standing there understood the terms. A cloak is a cloak. You fold it, you lay it on the grass, and it covers what it covers, the length of a woman, the width of her arms, no more. He had in his own mind given her nothing and lost nothing, and could go back to more pressing business before his meal grew cold. Brigid did not laugh. She thanked him as was proper, and unpinned the mantle from her shoulders. What happened next has been told in every telling of her life since, because no one who witnessed it, or heard of it from someone who had, could quite let it go. 4 of her companions took up the 4 corners of that plain woolen cloak and began, at her word, to walk. North, south, east, west, out across the grass of the curragh they went, and the cloak did not stay the size of a cloak. It spread. It grew beneath their hands as they walked, as though the wool itself had decided it would not be bound by what wool is supposed to do, stretching wider with every step until it lay over acres, over the whole breadth of that fair plain, further than any man on horseback could have ridden in the time it took the king's steward to find his voice. The king watched his own jest unravel in front of him. He had bargained in the currency of the ordinary world, a cloak's width, a woman's presumption, and found himself outmatched by a power that did not recognise the ordinary world's arithmetic at all. Fear will do more to move a proud man than argument ever does, and Leinster's king felt it plainly. This was no bondwoman's daughter playing at holiness. Whatever god she served had put his hand on the wool itself. He gave her the land, all of it, the whole spreading breadth the cloak had claimed, and more besides, for a man frightened into generosity tends to overcorrect, and the King of Leinster, by every account that has come down to us, wanted very much to be remembered as a friend to this woman, rather than a fool who had tried to cheat her. Some say he offered gifts on top of the land. Some say the fright did more for his soul that day than any sermon could have, and that he numbered himself, from then on, among those who gave freely to her foundation rather than grudgingly. Whatever else changed in him, the land was hers, sealed not by parchment, but by something no chieftain in Ireland would have dared to contest twice. It is worth sitting with that image a moment before moving past it, because the cloak is not only a wonder, it is a key to the whole shape of what she was about to build. A king measures land in the currency of power. This much ground supports this many cattle, feeds this many warriors, is worth this much tribute. Brigid measured nothing that way. She had spent her whole girlhood giving away what was counted precious by every reckoning but her own, and now the very instrument of her poverty, a poor woman's mantle, the only garment she owned to offer as security for a bargain, became the means by which abundance was poured out instead. The cloak did not simply cover ground, it answered in wool and grass the argument her father had been losing to her since she was a child too young to be reasoned with, that what she gave away multiplied, and what she withheld would only have shrunk. The oak was already standing when she came. It rose alone on that plain above the Liffey, ancient enough that no one living could say who had planted it or when, broad enough that its shade in summer covered ground a whole household might shelter beneath. Trees like that carried weight in Ireland before Brigid ever came near it. The old religion had its sacred groves, its reverence for certain oaks and certain wells, a way of reading holiness into the standing things of the earth that Christian Ireland did not so much destroy as baptize. Brigid did not fell it. She built beneath it and around it, and let it stand at the heart of what she was making, and so the church that rose there took its name from the tree that shaded it, Kildare, the Church of the Oak. Kildare, as it would come to be said in the English tongue centuries later, but the Irish holds the older truth plainer. This was a church planted quite literally in the shadow of what had been sacred before her, made sacred again, made sacred more fully, without a single root disturbed. There is something of her whole life folded into that choice. She did not scorn what had gone before her. She did not need to burn the grove to build the church. The oak that pagan Leinster had venerated for its age and its silence became, under her hand, a witness instead to something it had never held before. Bread broken beneath its branches, psalms rising into its leaves, the poor fed in its shade, and it kept standing regardless, the same tree, asked now to hold a different kind of reverence than the one it had known. It was beneath that oak, or near enough to it, that the two are remembered as one image, that the flame was first kindled. We have already seen the fire that would not be smothered, the flame her father found no way to put out, the sign over the child's head in the night that told the household something larger than themselves had already claimed her. That fire had followed her since infancy without ever quite becoming a fixed thing, a portent that flared and vanished as portents do. At Kildare it found its permanent home. Brigid gathered women around her who wished to give their whole lives to Christ, and among the disciplines she set for that growing household of women was this: a fire would be kept burning, day and night, without ceasing, tended in careful rotation, so that no single woman bore the whole weight of it, and no night ever found the flame untended. It was not merely a hearth fire kept for warmth or cooking, though it warmed them and it fed them too in its way. It was a sign deliberately kept of the presence that does not go out, the light Christ himself had promised would not be overcome by darkness, made visible in the plainest way available to a community of women on an Irish plain. Coals banked and watched, breathed on gently in the small hours, fed with care through every season, generation after generation of hands passing the same charge to the hands that came after them. The world outside that enclosure would change beyond anything Brigid could have imagined. Kings would rise and fall, armies would cross that plain, centuries would turn, and still, for as long as her daughters kept faith with what she had begun, that flame would not go dark. It became, in time, one of the most famous fires in Christian Ireland, spoken of by pilgrims who had never set foot in Kildare and never would, simply because word of a fire that does not go out travels further than almost anything else a community can offer the world. A flame is patient. It asks nothing of those who hear of it except that they believe it is still burning and trust that someone, somewhere, is tending it faithfully in the dark. A monastery, though, is more than a fire and a field, however wide the field or however faithful the fire. It needs the sacraments. It needs a bishop. Brigid was abbess. That much was never in question, not from the first stone laid at Kildare. She governed. She founded. She decided the shape the community would take and held the authority that bound it together, and no one in Ireland, then or in the long centuries after, seriously disputed that the household on the plain of the Liffey answered to her. But the sacraments Christ gave his church require priesthood, and priesthood in its fullness requires a bishop to ordain and to consecrate. And Brigid, for all that God had clearly set his hand upon her, was a woman, and the order of the church did not make women bishops, then or ever. She did not fight that order. She did not need to. She simply went and found the man the order required and brought him into her house on her own terms. His name was Conleth, and before Brigid ever sent for him he had been living the life so many holy men of that century chose, alone, a hermit, given over to prayer in some quiet corner away from the noise of tribes and kings. He was known, too, for a skill that seems almost too fitting to be believed, except that Ireland has never doubted it. He worked metal, a craftsman's hand at the forge, able to shape gold and silver and bronze into the vessels and ornaments a great church would need, chalices, book covers, the fine work that would come to make Kildare renowned, not only for its holiness, but for the beauty of what its holiness produced. Brigid called him from his solitude to come and be bishop to her community, and he came. What they built together at Kildare had no true precedent in Ireland. It was a double monastery, one household, one enclosure, holding within it both a community of women under Brigid's rule and a community of men under Conleith's priestly ministry, the two living in ordered proximity, sharing the one great church divided by a screen so that each community might worship together yet apart, sharing the one flame, the one table's bounty, the one mission. Brigid held the governing authority over the whole of it. Conleith held the sacramental office the church required. Neither arrangement swallowed the other. It was not compromise so much as completion, two forms of consecrated life and two forms of Christian authority, woven together under one roof the way the rushes of a cross are woven under one hand. Each strand needed, none of them the whole shape by itself. There was nothing else quite like it on the island, not at that scale, not with a woman standing so plainly at the head of it. Men had built monasteries, men had gathered disciples and founded rules and drawn students from across Ireland to sit at their feet. But here was a household where the founding authority, the governing hand, the name the whole enterprise would carry through the centuries, belonged to a woman, and no bishop, no king, no rival abbot ever mounted a serious challenge to it. Whatever unease the fact might have caused in quieter corners of the church, the plain result silenced it. Kildare flourished, students came, the poor were fed at its gate in numbers that would have beggared her father's whole estate many times over, and never once ran short. Craftsmen like Conleith found in it a home for their labour. Kings who had once measured her by the width of a cloak came, in time, to measure their own standing by whether Kildare thought well of them. The oak still stood at the centre of it, older than the walls raised in its shade. The flame still burned, tended without ceasing by hands that changed every generation but never let the fire itself lapse. And the ground beneath it all, the wide plain the Cloak had claimed, on a morning when a king thought he was giving away nothing, held a foundation that would outlast every one of the kings who ever ruled that country, exactly as the woman who spread her cloak upon it must, in some quiet certainty beneath her humility, have known that it would. The king's soldiers did not mean to kill the fox. That was the trouble of it. Carelessness is so much harder to punish than malice, and yet the fox was dead all the same, and the King of Leinster loved that fox the way some men love a hound or a hawk. It had been raised in his own hall from a kit, taught to walk on its hind legs and tumble and play dead at his word, a small tame wonder that made his warriors laugh at table. The young men who killed it, by accident, the old accounts insist, though accidents in a king's court still carry a price, were seized and bound and told they would die for it, or else be made slaves for the rest of their days. A fox's life weighed against a man's. That was the arithmetic of kings. Word of it reached Brigid, the way trouble always seemed to find her, carried on the breath of some frightened messenger who knew that if anyone in Ireland could untangle this, it was the abbess of Kildare. She did not send soldiers or silver. She went out to the edge of the wood where the trees stood black and watching, and she asked. What happened next is the kind of thing the Bethu Bricte sets down without apology, because the men and women who first told it were not interested in explaining a miracle away, they were interested in remembering it exactly. A wild fox came out from among the trees. Not tame, not raised in any hall, a creature that had never known a human hand except perhaps to flee it, and it came to her the way a dog comes to its master, and it followed her back into the king's own court, and there, before the assembled hall, it did every trick the dead fox had ever done. It walked upright, it tumbled, it played dead and rose again at the word. The king laughed the way he had laughed before, and the bound men were freed on the spot, their debt paid in a currency no one in that hall had ever seen coined. And then, because the story would not be true to her if it stopped there, the fox was told it must stay, kept as the old one had been kept, a permanent fixture of the king's hearth. It would not. The moment its purpose was served, it turned from the hall and the fire and the offered scraps, and went back through the door and into the trees, and was never seen at that court again. Brigid had not tamed it. She had only asked it, once, to help her save 2 lives, and it had done what she asked, and then gone home to be what it was. There is something in that small detail, the fox's flight back to the wild, the instant the men were safe, that tells you more about her power than the trick itself. She did not bend creation to her will. Creation, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, simply chose to answer when she called, and then went on being itself. It happened again, differently, with a boar. She kept swine at Kildare, as any great household did. Pigs turned loose to root and fatten in the mast of the oak woods that gave the place its name. One evening a wild boar came crashing out from among the trees, a boar with tusks that could open a man's leg to the bone, the kind of animal every swineherd in Ireland gave a wide berth, and instead of scattering her herd or goring the nearest sow, it walked in among her own pigs and lay down among them as if it had been born there. it stayed. It fattened alongside the rest, gentle as a yearling, and no one at Kildare ever again feared to walk past it. The wildest thing in the forest had looked at her household and decided, apparently, that it wanted to belong to it. You could say the same thing happened with the food itself. There is a story, one of the oldest attached to her name, told and retold until it became almost shorthand for who she was, about butter. A woman came to Kildare needing more than she had, as women so often did, and now Brigid gave from the monastery's store without counting the cost, the way she had given her father's sword hilt away as a child, the way she had given the cloak that spread to cover a kingdom. Her stewards worried, as stewards do, there would not be enough left for the community itself, for the guests who came daily to the gate, for the poor who lined up each morning the way the sun lines up along the eastern wall. And then the churns were full again. Not once, but as a matter of course, as though scarcity itself had simply declined to take root in her presence. The butter measured out to the poor never seemed to leave the vat any emptier than it had been, and this was not remarked upon as strange so much as expected, the way you expect rain in April. It was simply how things were at Kildare, when Brigid was the one doing the giving. The ale was the same, and better documented because it happened at a time everyone remembered, during the great fast and feast that surrounds Easter, when every church for miles wanted its vat full for the celebration, and there was, that year, only one vat of malt to be found in the whole of the district. One measure, not enough, by any ordinary reckoning, to fill the needs of even a single small church, let alone the several that looked to Kildare as their mother house. She blessed it. And from that single vat, that one measure of malt that should by any honest accounting have run dry after the first pouring, ale flowed out sufficient for every church that needed it, all the way through to the octave of Easter, when the feast at last gave way to ordinary time again. Coggitus is writing her life within living memory of people who had themselves seen the fields and the gate and the guest house of Kildare, tells this kind of story not as embellishment but as simple record. This is what the vat did, this is what the churns did, this is what happened when the abbess put her hand to the household stores. He was not trying to impress anyone with wonders, he was trying to explain why half of Leinster kept walking up the road to her door, because they did keep coming. That is the plain fact. Underneath all the wonder, Kildare, by the middle years of her abbacy, was not simply a monastery, a quiet place of prayer behind a wall. It was a household in the oldest and largest sense of that word, the kind of household that in ancient Ireland measured a chieftain's greatness, how many could eat at his table, how many strangers slept safe under his roof, how many left better off than they arrived. Brigid built exactly that kind of greatness, except the table was Christ's and the roof was raised in his name, and no one, bishop or beggar, king or leper, was measured differently at her gate. The sick came first, because the sick always come first to anyone whose hands are known to heal. A leper walked Kildare the way lepers walked everywhere in that world, at the edges of paths, warned off by bells or by their own ragged clothing, and at her door he was not warned off. She washed him. The Vita Prima keeps this detail, plain and unadorned, no embroidery needed, and where the water touched, the disease lifted its hand and went elsewhere. A woman who had been mute found her voice at Brigid's word, and the first thing out of that recovered mouth, every account insists, was praise, not surprise, as though the tongue once freed knew exactly what it had been saved for. A man who could not see, saw. These are not stories told with fanfare in the old lives. They are told the way you would tell a neighbour what happened at market, brief and certain, because everyone listening already half expected it. The sick were healed at Kildare so regularly that it stopped being news and became instead simply another feature of the place, like the oak trees or the well. What made this bearable, what kept Kildare from being swallowed whole by its own generosity, the way a smaller and less blessed household surely would have been, was that the abundance never seemed to run on ordinary supply. A community that fed every stranger at its gate, that poured ale for every neighbouring church, that gave butter away by the churnful, should by every rule of husbandry have gone hungry within a season. Kildare did not. The dairy herds under her care were remembered as giving milk not once a day as was usual, but as much as 3 times over, lakes of it, more than the pails could easily hold, so that even after the community's own needs were met and every guest fed and every poor hand filled, there was still milk left standing in the vessels. It was not that Brigid worked some trick of arithmetic on the material world. It was that wherever she gave without counting the cost, the world seemed to answer her the same way the fox had answered, freely and past all reasonable expectation, and then it went on being itself, the cows still cows, the barley still barley, only somehow never running short. This is the part of her story that people who did not grow up with a rush cross over the door sometimes find hardest to sit with, not the healing, which every tradition has its saints for, but the sheer domestic scale of it, the butter, the ale, the pigs and the milk and the guest house always full. It can sound almost too homely to be holy, but that is exactly the point the old lives are making, and exactly why the Irish, of all the peoples of the earth, took her so completely to their hearts as Mary of the Gael. She was not a saint of the desert, withdrawn from bread and butter and the ordinary hungers of a household. She was a saint of the dairy and the guest house and the granary, because that was the Ireland she had been born into, a hard, wet, working land where hospitality was the truest measure of holiness a person could offer, and where a chieftain's household was judged by how many strangers left its gate with a full belly. Brigid simply took that measure, the oldest measure her people had, and filled it past any human capacity to fill it, so that everyone who walked away from Kildare, fed or healed or freed, carried with them the same unspoken lesson: this is what it looks like when heaven keeps a household. Word of a place like that does not stay contained to one valley for long. Kings came, and not only the King of Leinster with his grief over a dead fox, chieftains from farther out, bishops from other foundations, poets whose trade was the memory of wonders, and who found here more wonders than they could carry home in verse. The poor came in numbers no smaller household could have absorbed, and were absorbed anyway, fed anyway, and sent on their way with something more than they arrived carrying. Lepers who elsewhere in Ireland lived and died at the margin of every settlement found at Kildare's gate not a bell rung to warn others away from them, but a hand held out. It became, within her own lifetime, exactly what a great monastic household was meant to become, and so rarely does. A place where scarcity itself seemed to lose its nerve at the threshold, where the vat was always somehow deeper than it looked, and where the wildest things of the forest, fox and boar alike, had already shown the whole of Leinster what every human visitor eventually learned for themselves, that whatever this woman asked of the world, on behalf of whoever stood in need before her, the world found a way to give. The road to Armagh ran north through country Brigid did not know, and she went anyway because word had come that the man everyone was speaking of, the Briton who had once been a slave, who had walked away from his master's flocks and returned a bishop, wanted to meet her. She was young for such a summons. She went all the same. What passed between Brigid and Patrick when they finally stood face to face, no chronicler troubled to record in full, and that is its own kind of mercy. Some meetings are too large for transcription. What the old annals do tell us, and tell us plainly, without the hedging they use for lesser matters, is that between these two, the pillars of the Irish Church, there grew a friendship so complete that they were said to share one heart and one counsel. Not two great figures circling one another with the wary courtesy of equals. One heart, one mind. It is the kind of line a scribe does not reach for lightly, and the fact that it survives at all, copied and recopied across centuries of vellum, tells you something of how deeply it was believed. Think of what that friendship meant, in practical terms, in a country still finding its way toward Christ. Patrick was the missionary who had walked from the mountains of Antrim to the plains of Meath, baptizing kings and burning idols, and founding churches faster than he could properly staff them. Brigid was building something Patrick had not built, a household of prayer that did not simply visit a place and move on, but stayed, took root, fed the poor at its gate every single day of the year. Between the two of them, Ireland was being made Christian in two different registers at once, the travelling word and the standing hearth. Patrick lit fires as he passed. Brigid kept one burning. They did not always walk the same roads, but the tradition holds, and holds firmly, that when Patrick preached, Brigid's name was near his lips, and when pilgrims came to Kildare in later years asking after the great apostle of Ireland, the nuns would tell them, ask also after Naho Brigid, for the one cannot be understood without the other. There is a story, worn smooth by telling, the way river stones are worn smooth by water, that Patrick once fell asleep during a long day of preaching, and dreamed. In the dream he saw all of Ireland, the whole shape of the island laid out before him like a green cloth, and a woman walked across it sowing seed from the fold of her cloak, seed that took root wherever her foot had passed. When he woke and told it to those around him, someone said, was it Brigid herself, in another telling, standing near enough to hear, that the woman in the dream could only be her. Whether Patrick dreamed it in those exact words, or whether the tellers of later generations dressed the memory in finer clothes, the meaning underneath has never been in dispute. Ireland was to have two great founders, walking different roads toward the same fire, and neither would ever be spoken of, by the faithful, entirely apart from the other. If Patrick gave her friendship, it was a young nun named Dara who gave her something rarer still, a story about sight, and about what sight is actually for. Dara had been blind from childhood, or blind long enough that no one at Kildare remembered her any other way. She was one of Brigid's own, close to her the way certain souls become close to certain others without any explanation beyond grace. They simply understood one another, the abbess and the blind nun, in the particular language of people who have decided to give their whole lives to the same small patch of ground. They would sit together in the evenings after the work was done, when the light was failing anyway, and it made no difference to Dara whether it was, and they would talk about God the way women talk who have stopped needing to be careful with one another. One such evening, the fields outside gone violet, the sky doing whatever the sky does at that hour that sighted people take entirely for granted, Brigid reached out and touched Dara's eyes, and Dara saw. She saw the whole of it at once. The way a person who has waited her entire life for a single gift receives it all in a single instant with no gentleness at all. The fields folding into hills, the hills folding into the shapes of clouds moving above them, the exact green of early summer grass, her own hands. Brigid's face, for the first time in her life, lined already with the work of the community and the weather of the road, and older than Dara had imagined it. She sat with her new eyes and looked at everything there was to look at until the wonder of it had run its whole course. And then she asked Brigid to take it back, not out of ingratitude. Nothing in the story suggests that, nothing in the tradition allows it to be read that way. She asked because she had understood something in those hours of seeing that she could not otherwise have understood, and having understood it, she no longer needed the eyes that had taught it to her. The things of this world, however lovely, however worth the looking, were less to her than what she had already been seeing all along in the dark, the shape of God's love in her own soul, undimmed by any weather, unbothered by any nightfall. She had spent her blind years in a kind of seeing the sighted rarely manage. Now that she knew what the world looked like, she was ready to close the door on it again and go back to the better country she had never actually left. Brigid touched her eyes a second time and the blindness returned, and by every account that has come down to us, Dara was glad of it. It is one of the strangest gifts in the whole of Brigid's story, and one of the most Irish in its instincts, because it refuses the obvious moral. A lesser telling would have Dara keep her sight and praise God loudly for it ever after. Ours does not. Ours understands that the miracle was never really about the eyes. It was about a woman who had spent her whole life learning to see rightly in the dark, being shown, briefly, that she had already arrived where sighted people spend their whole lives trying to get to, and choosing, with her eyes wide open for the only time in her life, to go home. Brigid loved Dara for this, the way you love someone who has taught you something you did not know you needed teaching. And it is worth saying plainly what the story assumes without ever stating it outright, that Brigid herself understood exactly what Dara meant, understood it well enough to grant the request without argument, without trying to talk her out of the gift. An abbess less wise might have insisted the sight was better kept. Brigid knew better. She knew there is a seeing that has nothing to do with the eyes, and she had spent her whole life practicing it. That practiced sight is, perhaps, what carried her down every road she ever travelled, because Brigid was not a woman who stayed put, whatever the image of the perpetual flame and the walled enclosure at Kildare might suggest to someone meeting her for the first time. The flame stayed. Brigid did not entirely, not for long stretches at a time. She rode the roads of Ireland in a chariot, the way an abbess of consequence did in that century, and the roads she rode were not smooth ones. They were cart tracks worn into the boglands, fords across rivers swollen with rain, the long spine of high ground that ran down through Leinster into Munster, and the harder country north and west, where the tribes kept their own old ways and were not always glad to see a bishop's cross or an abbess's chariot come rattling up their lane. She went anyway. Tradition remembers her crossing into Munster to found communities of women there, into Connacht, where the land turned stony and the people turned no less generous for it, north as far as the territories where Patrick himself had laboured, wherever a chieftain sent word that his people wanted a church, wherever a household of women asked to be gathered under a rule and given a purpose beyond what the world had offered them. She met kings on those roads, not always as a supplicant, the way her father had once made her stand as a suppliant before Dubtack's hard bargaining, but as a woman kings had learned to receive with the honour due to Christ's own messenger. She met the poor on those same roads in exactly the numbers you would expect of 5th century Ireland, which is to say in numbers that never seemed to end, and she fed them from whatever store she was carrying the way she had always fed them, without doing the arithmetic first. The chariot itself became part of how the stories were told and retold at firesides for generations after, the wheels that would not turn against her purposes, the horse that found the ford in floodwater no other horse would enter, the driver who learned, as everyone eventually learned who spent long enough in her company, that Brigid's plans and God's plans had a way of turning out to be the same plan, and that arguing with the first was a poor use of a man's time. None of it was showmanship. It never is in the true telling. It is simply what happens along the roads of a woman who has given her whole self over and has stopped expecting the ordinary rules to apply to her the way they apply to everyone else. And with every mile she rode, in every kingdom she crossed into, the name for her that the people had already begun using among themselves grew a little more fixed, until it was no longer a compliment paid by one grateful household, but a title the whole island had settled on without anyone formally deciding it. Muireann Gael, Mary of the Gael. It is worth sitting with how extraordinary that naming actually is, because it is easy generations later to hear the title and let it slide past as a pleasant old form of address, the sort of thing saints get called. It was not that. To name a living woman after the Mother of God, in a Christian world only a few generations removed from paganism, in a church still working out how far reverence for any human creature could properly go without brushing against something owed to God alone, that is not a title bestowed lightly, and it was not bestowed by clergy trying to flatter her, or by a synod voting on an honorific. It rose up from the people themselves, from ordinary households up and down the island who had been fed by her hand, healed by her prayer, sheltered under her cloak, taught the faith by way of a woven cross held up beside a dying man's bed. They looked at what she was doing for Ireland, gathering it, feeding it, forgiving it, mothering it into the household of Christ, the way an ordinary mother gathers her own children round a hearth, and the word that came to them, unbidden, was mother, not queen, not teacher, though she was that too, tirelessly. Mother, the title stuck in her own lifetime, which is rarer than it sounds. Most such names arrive after death, polished onto a life once it can no longer complicate them. Brigid was still riding the roads, still weaving crosses beside sick beds, still standing at the gate of Kildare handing bread to strangers, when Ireland had already decided what to call her. And she seems never to have argued the point, never to have corrected the people who used it in her hearing, the way she never once, in any surviving account, turned away a beggar to protect her own stores. She let the name settle on her the way she let everything settle on her that God seemed to want placed there, without grasping for it, and without refusing it either. Patrick had his own great name by then, Apostle of Ireland, the man who had planted the faith in soil that had never held it. But it was said, and is still said, that between the two names, his and hers, there was no rivalry at all, only the old friendship continuing in a new form, one heart, one counsel, carried forward now not by two people meeting on a road, but by two titles the whole of Ireland had agreed, without a single recorded quarrel, to hold in the same breath. Patrick, the father of the Irish Church, Brigid, its mother. It is a completeness you rarely find handed to you so simply in any history, sacred or otherwise. Two founders, one male, one female, each fully themselves, each irreplaceable, and neither ever asked to make room for the other by shrinking. She kept riding those roads for years afterward, out from Kildare and back again, out and back, the way the tide goes out from a shore, and always returns to it, because Kildare was where the flame was kept, and Kildare was where, in the end, she was always going to come home. But every road she took away from it carried the name a little further, into every kingdom, every household, every generation of Irish mothers who would one day teach their own daughters to weave a small cross from rushes each February, and never once have to explain who they were weaving it in honour of. Ireland had found, in the middle of the 5th century, a mother it did not know it was looking for, and having found her, it has never, in all the centuries since, let go of the name it gave her. The 1st of February in the year the annals call 524, though the old monks who kept such things were never certain of a year where Brigid was concerned, only of a day, dawned cold over Kildare, and Naum Brid did not rise with it. She had been failing since the turn of the year. The community knew it the way a household knows the shape of a coming loss before anyone says the word aloud, in the way she asked to be carried to the doorway of her cell, to feel the light rather than walking to it herself, in the way she called the sisters to her 1 and 2 at a time, rather than gathering them all, as if she were putting each of them away carefully, like linens folded for a long absence. She was old by then, older than most women of her century lived to see, and the great work of her hands, the founding, the building, the endless negotiating of land and law and grudge that had made Kildare what it was, had at last worn down even that furnace of a body. But her mind, they said, stayed clear to the last hour, clear enough to bless, clear enough to choose. The one she chose was Darlugdach. If you have read this far, you already know the name. Even if you have not paused on it, the young nun who had shared Brigid's bed in the old Irish way of soul friendship, Anam Cara, the two women praying through the cold nights of Kildare with nothing but each other's warmth and God between them. Darlú Haid had been Brigid's shadow for years, her hands when Brigid's hands were needed in two places, her voice when Brigid's voice was hoarse from bargaining with kings. It was Darlú who knelt closest on that last morning, and it was to Darlugo that Brigid gave Kildare, not as an office passed down the way a bishop hands down a diocese, but as a mother hands a candle to a daughter she trusts to keep it lit. The rule of the double monastery, the care of the flame, the 1,000 small mercies that kept a community of monks and nuns, fed and governed and at peace with one another, all of it passed in that hour to a woman young enough to have been Brigid's own child, and the elder sisters who might have expected the honour did not, it seems, begrudge her it. That alone tells you something about the kind of authority Brigid built at Kildare. It was not a throne, it was a fire meant to be carried. She died as the light was changing, not the dead of night, the way we might imagine a saint slipping away in shadow, but at the hinge of the day, which is fitting for a woman whose whole life had been lived at hinges, between the free woman and the enslaved, between the old gods and the new, between the kitchen and the altar. The community that had gathered around her bed did what Irish Christians have always done at such an hour. They prayed her out. They did not weep loudly, not yet. Grief in that tradition waited its turn behind the office of the dying, and when the breath at last did not come again, the bell of Kildare rang out over the plain the way it must have rung 1,000 ordinary evenings before, except that everyone standing near it that morning understood it would never sound ordinary again. They buried her at Kildare, of course. Where else would they have laid Mary of the Gael but in the ground she herself had claimed under the oak, the ground her whole life had bent itself toward reaching? Cogitosus, writing his life of her within a lifetime or two of her death, describes the shrine that grew up over her resting place with a kind of wonder that still carries across the centuries in his Latin, a tomb set to the right of the high altar, adorned, he says, with gold and silver and gemstones, with crowns of precious metal hanging above it, and images worked into the ornament, so that pilgrims coming into the great church at Kildare would have seen, quite literally, wealth poured out around her bones, the way the poor of Leinster had once seen wealth poured out from her hands. It was not vanity, it was the community answering, in the only language available to it, the scale of what she had been to them. She had spent her whole life giving away silver, giving away her father's chariot, giving away a bishop's vestments to lepers on the road, and now, at the last, they gave it back to her, heaped it around the small quiet dark of her grave, because there was nowhere else left to put their love. Cogitosus tells us too that Conleth, the bishop craftsman who had shared the governance of Kildare with her, who had worked the metal for her altar vessels and shared in his own way the burden of a foundation too large for any one person to carry, was laid to rest on the other side of that same altar, so that the two founders of the double monastery kept their places on either hand of the sanctuary even in death, as they had kept them in life, the abbess and the bishop, the woman's authority and the man's, standing together at the heart of the church. Neither could have built alone. There is a detail from that first year after her death that the old storytellers love to linger on, and I confess I love it too. Darludach, the daughter of her heart, the one chosen to carry the flame forward, died exactly 1 year later, on the 1st of February again, to the very day. The tradition does not explain this as illness or accident. It simply lays the fact down, the way it lays down so many of the quiet wonders of Brigid's story, and lets the reader feel the weight of it unassisted, that the bond between those two women was strong enough to reach across the grave and pull one after the other, like two flames lit from the same wick going out within a year of each other, as if grief itself had a season and Darludic's had run its full course precisely when Brigid's had. Whatever you make of it, it fixed the 1st of February in the memory of the Irish Church forever after, not only as the day now Brigid was born into the world and the day she was born out of it, but as the day her chosen daughter followed her. La Fela Brigid carries all of that inside it, layered like rings in a felled tree. For a few centuries Kildare held the flame she had kindled, or, as the old tradition insists, that had never truly gone out since the pagan fires on that same ground before her, burned on inside its enclosure of woven hedge and later of stone, tended without interruption by the nuns who came after Darludach, generation folding into generation the way rushes fold into a cross. Pilgrims came. Kings still came, though fewer of them now needed converting, since by the century after her death most of Ireland had already given its heart to the faith she had done so much to plant. Kildare grew rich, as Cogitosus' shrine suggests, rich enough to be a target, and it is here that the long silence of this chapter begins to gather. The Vikings found Kildare in the 9th century, and they found it more than once. The raiders who came up the rivers looking for monastic silver and monastic slaves did not spare the Church of the Oak any more than they spared Iona or Lindisfarne or the dozens of other undefended foundations that had made the mistake of being both holy and wealthy. The annals record the burnings almost wearily, one after another across the 9th and 10th centuries. Kildare plundered, Kildare burned, Kildare plundered again, the way a family might record, in a single terse line each time, that the house had flooded again. And yet each time the community rebuilt, and each time, by every account the tradition is kept, the flame was carried out before the fire took the enclosure and carried back in once the ash had cooled. Stone can burn, wood certainly burns, but a flame tended by hands who love it can be walked out the door in a covered lamp faster than any raider can reach it, and this, more than any wall, is what kept the perpetual flame perpetual through those centuries of fire. The bones were less easily protected than the flame. Sometime in that same violent stretch of Irish history, the exact date is one of the places where even the most devoted chroniclers admit uncertainty. A decision was made to move what remained of Brigid, along with what remained of Patrick himself and of Columcille, into a single shared resting place at Downpatrick in the north, where it was hoped the relics of Ireland's 3 great founding saints together would be safer than any one of them scattered and alone. The old rhyme that Irish children were still learning in my own grandmother's time carries the memory of it plainly enough. In down 3 saints one grave do fill, Patrick, Brigid and Columcille. Whether every bone made that journey north, or only a portion, honoured alongside a stone marking the rest at Kildare, the tradition does not insist on settling. What it insists on is the image itself, the 3 pillars of the Irish Church, the missionary man, the desert father wanderer, and the abbess of the double monastery, gathered at last into one ground, as if even in death Ireland could not bear to keep her saints apart. The flame at Kildare, meanwhile, suffered its own strange interruptions centuries later, when a bishop of the Anglo-Norman Church, uneasy at a fire kept by women that answered to no authority but their own long unbroken custom, ordered it extinguished as a superstition unbecoming a reformed diocese. It went out. For how long, no one agrees, a matter of years, not centuries, but the silence of that gap is its own kind of testimony, because the fire did not stay out, it was relit, by hands the record does not trouble to name, and it burned on again until a later age, a harder age, brought a suppression no relighting could answer, the dissolution of the monasteries, when the crown of Henry VIII swept through Ireland as it had swept through England, and the great foundations that had stood for 1,000 years were stripped of their roofs and their communities, and at Kildare, at last, of their fire. That grief belongs to another part of this story than the one I am telling you here, and it is grief enough to deserve its own full telling elsewhere. What belongs here is only this, that after Naughtbreed's own death it was not one silence that fell over Kildare, but several, each one broken, each one falling again like a bell struck and struck and struck across 1,000 years until the bronze itself grew tired. And her bones, or what the centuries had left of them, did not even have the mercy of staying put through all of that. Sometime in the 13th century, by an old and treasured account, 3 Irish knights returning from the wars in the Holy Land carried a portion of her relics, her skull, the tradition says, out of Ireland entirely, across the sea to Portugal, where they enshrined it in a small church in the town of Lumiar, near Lisbon. It rests there still, in a chapel the local fishing families have visited for the protection of their boats, for longer than anyone now living can say, calling on a saint from an island most of them will never see, in a language she never spoke, because somewhere in the long chain of hands that carried that relic across the sea, someone had thought to tell them who she was, and what she had done for the people who first loved her, and it had been enough. Nom Brigid, who once fed her father's whole household from an empty larder, who clothed the poor of Leinster from a single cloak, had crossed the ocean in a box of bone and found herself feeding faith to strangers again. This, I think, is the real shape of what happened to Brigid after that first morning at Kildare. The stone did not hold her. The shrine Cogitosus described so lovingly, gold and silver and gemwork around her resting place, is gone, burned, plundered, and finally simply worn away by time the way all such things are, until nothing marks the spot at Kildare today but a modern memory and a well nearby that still draws pilgrims with far less ceremony than the medieval crowds who came to kneel at her tomb. The perpetual fire itself, kindled and quenched and kindled again across 15 centuries, would not survive the era of the monastery's fall though, and this the tradition holds close, like a promise folded small enough to carry in a pocket. A fire does not have to burn without interruption to be perpetual in the sense that matters, it only has to be capable of being lit again, and it was. But it is the scattering itself that I want you to sit with a moment longer, because it is not in the end a story of loss, the way we usually mean that word. Yes, the great church at Kildare fell to ruin. Yes, her bones went north to Down, and her skull went south to Portugal, and no single grave holds the whole of what remains of her body on this earth. But look at what the scattering did instead of what it took. It meant that her name travelled every road her bones travelled, and further, that Irish monks carrying her memory onto the continent in the centuries after her death planted churches to her, from France to Germany, to the edges of the Alps, long before any Viking axe touched Kildare. It meant that when the Irish themselves were scattered 8 and 9 centuries later, driven onto coffin ships by famine and by law, they carried her not in reliquaries, they had none, and no time to fetch one even if they had, but in the one form no ship's hold could confiscate and no crossing could drown, the rushes gathered from a ditch, the 4-armed cross woven in an hour by hands that had learned the shape from a grandmother who had learned it from hers, hung above a door in Boston or Sydney or Buenos Aires exactly as it had hung above a door in Kildare 1,000 years before. Stone can burn, a name carried in the hands of exiles cannot be burned at all, because it is never in one place long enough for the fire to reach it. That is the long silence this chapter set out to hold, and it is not, when you look at it steadily, a silence in the way that word usually frightens us. The bell rang out over Kildare on the morning she died, and then, for centuries, the record grows thin, and the ground itself grows quiet, and the great shrine crumbles into a field. But somewhere in every one of those centuries, in some kitchen far from Leinster, someone was still weaving the cross, still telling the story of the cloak and the dying chieftain, and the empty larder that filled itself at her word. The silence was never total. It was only waiting, the way rushes wait in a ditch through the whole of January, for the 1st of February to come around again, and for hands that had never seen Kildare to remember, without quite knowing why the shape mattered so much, exactly how she liked it woven. 19 women kept the fire. Every night one of them carried the watch, feeding the coals through the dark hours, so that no dawn ever broke over Kildare to find the flame gone out. On the 20th night, the nun whose turn it was laid down her armful of kindling, banked what burned, and walked away, because the 20th night belonged to Naun Brigid herself. The community believed she came in the dark and tended her own fire, unseen, and that no man's breath was ever to touch it, not even to blow it to life again. Gerald of Wales, the Welsh churchman who travelled through Ireland centuries later and wrote down what the nuns told him, marvelled at a fire that burned and yet consumed no more ash than the flame of a single evening. He called it inextinguishable. For nearly 1,000 years, it very nearly was. This is the part of the story that has no single hero because it belongs to no single woman. It belongs to generation after generation of nuns whose names went unrecorded, who woke in the cold hour before lauds to walk out to the firehouse ringed by its low hedge, who never let the watch lapse through Viking raid or Norman conquest, or the long centuries when Ireland itself seemed to be one kingdom's grief handed to the next. Kildare burned more than once. Raiders came up the river and put torches to the settlement, and still, when the smoke cleared, someone went back into what was left of the enclosure to see whether the flame in its house had survived. It nearly always had. The nuns rebuilt around it the way you would rebuild around a hearth that held the only warmth left in a house, because in the truest sense, that is exactly what it was. What the flame meant to the women who kept it, and what it meant to everyone beyond the abbey walls, were not quite the same thing, though they were bound tight together. Inside the enclosure, it was prayer made visible, a community's unbroken attention turned toward God through the smallest, most patient labour a person can perform, which is simply not letting a thing go dark. Outside the walls, among the farmers and travellers and petitioners who came to Kildare the way their grandparents had, the flame was Naun Brigid's own presence, proof that she had not left them, proof that the woman who once carried living coals in her apron without scorching the wool was still, in some sense that did not require explaining, tending her own hearth. Pilgrims who came to the monastery spoke less of relics and manuscripts than of the fire itself. You could stand at the hedge and feel the heat of a flame that predated your grandfather's grandfather, and know that the hands that first lit it belonged to Mary of the Gael. It could not last forever, and it did not. The record of exactly when and how the flame was finally put out is not written with a single clean date the way Naun Brigid's own death is remembered on the 1st of February. What the tradition holds is this. Sometime in the turning of the 16th century, as the Great Suppression fell across Ireland's monasteries and the English crown moved to end religious life wherever it found it, the fire at Kildare went dark. Some accounts lay the final quenching at a bishop's own order, uneasy at what looked, to reforming eyes, uncomfortably like the old pagan fires the Christian mission had once worked so hard to convert into something new. Whatever hand did it, the firehouse that had stood since the 5th century stood empty. The double monastery that had sheltered monks and nuns together under one abbess's rule was dissolved along with hundreds of others across the country. The bells stopped, the scriptorium's pens went still, and the flame that Gerald of Wales had called inextinguishable went out. For nearly 400 years it stayed out. This is the part of the story worth sitting with, because it is not a defeat, though it looks like one on its face. Fire can be put out, memory is harder to kill. Through every one of those 400 years, in kitchens and cottages across Ireland and wherever the Irish carried their faith into exile, the flame kept burning in a different way, in the fingers of women and children who sat down on the last night of January, took up handfuls of rushes pulled fresh from the ditch and wove them into the four-armed cross that has never once needed a church to survive. You have already met that cross, woven the first time beside a dying chieftain's bed. It did not stop being woven when the abbey fell silent. If anything, it was woven more fiercely because it had become the one piece of Naun Brigid's fire that no bishop's order and no crown's decree could reach. A cross of rushes costs nothing and asks no permission. Every February the 1st, in houses where the old ways were kept, and in Ireland more houses kept them than not, someone gathered the rushes, said the blessing, and hung the finished cross above the door for the coming year, exactly as it had been done since before living memory could say when it started. The flame at Kildare might be ash. The flame in the doorway never was. The saint's own body did not stay quiet either, though its story is a harder one to follow than the fires. In the 9th century, with Viking raiders working their way up every navigable river in Ireland and no monastery safe from the threat of the torch, the community that guarded Naun Brigid's relics made the decision to move them north for safekeeping, to lie alongside two other great patrons of Ireland, Naun Padraig himself and Colm Seal after him, in the one grave at Downpatrick. 3 of Ireland's greatest saints, sharing a single resting place, has been sung about and painted and carved into more headstones and holy cards than almost any other image in the whole tradition. It is a strange comfort, that grave. It says something true about how the Irish Church came to think of its founders, not as separate monuments each guarding their own patch of ground, but as a single household of holiness, gathered close against the wind. Not every fragment of the saint travelled north, though, and not every fragment stayed in Ireland at all. Relics move the way people move, carried by hands that believe they are protecting something precious from a danger bearing down. In the turbulence of a later century, tradition holds that a portion of Nambride's relics left Ireland entirely, carried across the sea to Portugal by knights who believed they were keeping her safe from ruin at home, and settled at last in a church at Lumiar near Lisbon, where they were venerated for hundreds of years by a community that had never walked the fields of Kildare and never needed to. Devotion does not require geography. It only requires memory, and the Portuguese kept hers faithfully long after most of Ireland had stopped thinking to ask where her relics had gone at all. They came home in the 20th century, not all at once, not with trumpets, but they came. In 1928, a portion of those Portuguese relics were returned to Ireland and given into the keeping of a parish church in Kildare, on the edge of Dublin, where they remain to this day, and in time some of that same portion made its way back to Kildare itself, to the town that had been her town since the 5th century, closing a circle that had been open for the better part of 1,000 years. Imagine what it must have felt like to stand in a church in Kildare and know that what lay before you had crossed the sea twice, once carried away in fear, once carried home in faith, and had never once through all of it stopped being hers. The flame took longer to come home than the relics did. It waited until the very end of the 20th century, and when it finally returned, it was women who brought it back, exactly as women had kept it in the first place. In 1993, a small community of Brigidine sisters, a religious order founded in Ireland at the close of the 19th century, taking their very name and rule of life from now Brigid herself, gathered in Kildare's Market Square on La Fée de Brigid to do something that had not been done in the town since before the Reformation. They relit the flame, not in the ruined firehouse of the old monastery, which had long since crumbled past use, but in a new hearth built for exactly this purpose, in the heart of the same town where the fire had first been lit 1,500 years before. Townspeople came out to stand in the square, clergy came. The cold February air of Kildare, the same cold that had once seen a baby born on a threshold between one world and the next, held the smoke of the newly kindled fire, and for the first time in 4 centuries, Kildare had its flame back. It has not gone out since. Today the flame kept by the Brigidine sisters burns in Kildare town, in a purpose-built firehouse not far from the ruins of the old abbey, tended now not by 19 anonymous nuns working through a nightly rota, but by a modern community that has taken up the same charge with the same seriousness, a charge that asks nothing more and nothing less than that the fire not be allowed to die. A short walk away stands Solus Brigid, a centre of Celtic spirituality founded by the sisters in the years after the relighting, where pilgrims come from every corner of the world to sit in silence, to walk the grounds, to be near the place where the story began and somehow never entirely ended. Solus Brigida means Brigid's light, and it is not a poetic name chosen for the brochure. It says exactly what the flame has always said. In every century it has burned, and every century it went dark and came back. That the light did not belong only to the 5th century, or only to the nuns who first fed it, or only to the sisters who relit it in a cold square in 1993. It belongs to whoever is willing to keep it. And every year, all across Ireland and in every parish and kitchen wherever her people have carried her name, Boston, Sydney, Chicago, a farmhouse outside Cork, a flat in London with an Irish grandmother's photograph on the wall, the rushes come out again on the last day of January. Children still learn the fold from a grandmother's hands, the same 4 bends that have never changed, the same 4 arms radiating from a centre the way sun radiates from itself. It is woven fresh every single year, because a rush cross is not meant to last forever hanging over a door. It is meant to be replaced faithfully on the same day, as a sign that the household has not forgotten and does not intend to. Last year's cross is taken down carefully and burned in the hearth, or kept in the rafters for the luck it carries, or laid in a field for blessing. The practice varies from parish to parish, the way all living traditions vary at their edges while staying exactly the same at the centre. What never varies is the 1st of February. What never varies is the weaving. Stand at that door on the morning of La Fée de Brigid. Watch a mother or a grandmother bend green rushes into a shape older than every ruin in Ireland, and you are watching the same gesture the nuns of Kildare performed with the fire itself for 1,000 years, the refusal, quiet and absolute, to let something sacred go dark simply because the world around it changed. Empires rose in Ireland and fell. A monastery that once housed hundreds of monks and nuns under one abbess's rule crumbled to a scatter of stone in a field. A flame that burned unbroken for a millennium went out by a bishop's order and stayed out for 4 centuries. And still every year, without fail, without needing to be told twice, the rushes are cut and the cross is woven and hung above the door for 1 more year of watching over the house. That is the truest thing this chapter has to tell you. The flame was never really the point. The flame was only ever the visible sign of something that could not be extinguished no matter how many centuries tried. The plain, stubborn devotion of ordinary people who decided, generation after generation, that Naum Brigid was still worth keeping close. They kept her in fire when they had a fire to keep her in. When the fire was taken from them, they kept her in rushes, in prayers said at dawn, in relics carried across the sea and carried home again, in a name given to daughters, in a well visited on her feast, in a cross renewed every single February, whether anyone outside the parish was watching or not. The flame in Kildare's Market Square burns tonight because the Brigidine sisters relit it in 1993, but it was never truly out. It only went underground, into the hands of the people, and waited there for 400 years until it was time to come up into the light again. There is a kitchen in Kildare tonight, and there will be one in Boston too, and one in Sydney, and one in a 5th-floor flat in Dublin, where a woman who has not been to Mass in years will still, without quite knowing why, pull the rushes from a bucket of water and begin to bend them into a cross. She learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. She does not remember the chieftain's name, or the fever, or the year. She only knows that this is what you do on the 1st of February, when the light comes back and the ewes begin to drop their lambs, and something in the marrow of the country remembers a woman who knelt on a dirt floor and told a dying man a story with her hands. That is Naomi Breed's genius, and it is why you have spent these pages with her. She never demanded that you understand her all at once. She met you where you were standing, a sick room, a kitchen, a bare hillside, and she began with what was already in your hand. You have walked with her now through the cross woven beside a dying chieftain, and through the strange dual light of her birth on a threshold that was neither wholly inside nor wholly outside a house. You have watched a child's hand hold fire without harm, and a cloak spread itself over more ground than any druid could measure. You have seen bread multiply and ale flow from an empty vat, and wild creatures come to her call, as though the whole unruly kingdom of nature recognised its true governor. You have heard Ireland itself, high king and poor widow alike, call her mother, and you have sat with her, at the end, through a last morning that came so gently that no one in the room could say the precise moment the woman beside them had become the saint above them. And you have seen her flame, the one her nuns kept lit for centuries at Kildare, banked and blown to life again generation after generation, refuse, even after fire and reformer and rupture, to go out for good. 9 chapters, a portrait, not the whole of her. And if you have felt, somewhere in these pages, the particular ache of wanting more of her mother's servitude and her father's temper, more of the abbey's daily bread and its daily miracles, more of the long centuries of pilgrims walking to her well, that ache is not a flaw in this book. It is the whole point of it. This little volume was never meant to hold Naomi Breed, nothing that size could. It was meant to open a door and let you feel the warmth coming through, so that you would want to walk the rest of the way into the house, because the rest of the house is there. The full life of Mary of the Gael is told in 3 volumes, and each one holds something this book could only gesture toward. The first is called Daughter of the Threshold, and it belongs to the girl before she was ever called saint. Here the story slows down in a way a single introductory chapter never could. You meet Brigid in full, not only the enslaved mother whose milk, tradition says, could not be given to her own daughter without a druid's blessing first, but the woman herself, her captivity, her dignity inside it, the particular cruelty of a household that owned her body and could not touch what was in her. You meet Dubtak, the chieftain father, in the fullness of his contradictions, a man of standing and appetite, exasperated by a daughter who gave away his wealth as fast as his cattle could produce it, and yet a man who in the end could never quite bring himself to sell her. The famous scene of Brigid at the sword's edge, Dubtak driving her to the king's court to be rid of her, ready to trade her for a price, only to watch his plan collapse in front of him, is told there at full length with all its heat and its comedy and its terror held together the way only a longer story can hold them. You will spend real time in that volume, inside the childhood miracles that this book could only touch in passing, the butter that would not stop giving, the dogs that guarded rather than stole, the small wonders of a girl who could not walk past hunger without feeding it. And you will follow her, at last, to the veil, to the bishop who is said to have looked at the young woman kneeling before him to be received into religious life, and marked her, by some accounts, with a rite of ordination unlike any given to a woman before or since, so that the pillar of fire that legend says rose from her head in that moment might mean far more than a pious flourish. That volume is her becoming. It is slow on purpose, because a call like hers deserves the years it actually took. The second volume is The Church of the Oak, and it is the Kildare book, the story of the woman this portrait has already shown you giving away cloaks and multiplying bread, but now followed into the daily, unglamorous, magnificent work of building something that lasted. This is where you find the founding itself, how a single oak tree and a single determined woman became a monastery that would outlive kingdoms, how Brigid gathered women around her who wanted nothing more than the life she offered, and how that life took shape, day by day, rule by unwritten rule. This is where the double monastery is not just named but explained, the astonishing fact of monks and nuns living under one roof and one abbess, a woman's authority extending, in a way almost nowhere else in the Christian world of her century, over men in orders as well as women in vows. You will meet Conleth, the bishop she is said to have called to Kildare to share in governing the community, and you will sit with the strange, uncatalogued authority Brigid held, not quite like an abbess elsewhere, not quite like a bishop, something Ireland alone seems to have made room for. That volume holds the artisans and the scholars Kildare drew to itself, the scriptorium where the lost book of Kildare is remembered to have dazzled visitors with illumination so fine that one medieval writer swore an angel must have guided the scribe's hand. It holds the miracles too, more of them, and told at greater length, because a woman's whole working life produces more wonder than 9 chapters can carry, the blind restored, the lepers cleansed, the lakes and wells that answered her prayer. This is the volume for anyone who has ever wondered what it actually looked like, day to day, for a woman in the 5th century to run a kingdom of the Spirit, the meetings, the harvests, the arguments settled, the guests fed, the whole enormous patient labour of building a church of the oak that would still be standing when every petty king who mocked her was dust. The 3rd volume is the flame that never went out, and it carries her from the last morning you have already sat through in this book into the centuries that followed, the true, long afterlife of a saint the Irish people simply refused to let go of. It tells of the perpetual flame at Kildare in its fullest telling, not just that the nuns kept it, but how the fence no man was permitted to cross, the strict rotation of women tending it night after night for hundreds of years, the awe of visitors like Gerald of Wales who came centuries later and wrote of a fire that seemed to him inextinguishable, ringed by ash that never held footprints inside its bounds. It tells of the flame's darkest hour, when Reformation swept through Ireland and the fire at Kildare was finally forcibly put out, a silence that this book has only allowed you to glimpse, and it tells, with the same honesty, of how that silence did not hold. The flame was lit again. It burns today, tended once more by Brigidine sisters in Kildare, a fact that turns this whole story from history into something closer to a promise kept. That volume follows her cross into every kitchen that still weaves one, her feast day into every quiet ritual of spring cleaning and dolly making and door blessing that marks the 1st of February across Ireland and far beyond it. Her name into the hospitals and schools and parishes carried across oceans by the Irish diaspora who took her with them the way they took their language and their grief. It holds the centuries of pilgrims at her holy wells, the cures reported there, the ribbons tied on thorn trees beside the water. It holds, too, the honest complications, the disputes among scholars about which stories are oldest, which Vita said what first, how much of the woman and how much of the legend has come down to us tangled together, because that volume trusts you enough to give you the whole conversation, not just the comfortable parts of it. And it ends where this small book cannot, in the present tense, in the kitchen with the rushes, in the flame that is, right now, still burning. 3 volumes then, a girl becoming a saint building a church's fire refusing, across 15 centuries, to go dark. Together they are the fuller portrait this short book could only sketch, the whole shape of Mary of the Gael, told with the patience her life deserves. But I do not want you to close this book feeling that you have been handed a catalogue. You have been handed an invitation, and an invitation is not measured by its length. Everything you need to love her is already here. You know the shape of her hands now, the ones that wove across from rushes on a dirt floor, and the ones that, by every account the faithful have kept, could hold fire without being burned by it. You know her mother's servitude and her father's exasperated love. You know that a cloak in her hands could cover a kingdom, that bread in her hands could feed a crowd, that a word from her could calm a wolf or gentle a wild boar into lying down at her feet like a lamb. You know that when she died, no single person in the room could say when, exactly, the ordinary woman they had loved became the saint the whole of Ireland would call mother for 1500 years and counting. And you know that the fire they lit for her at Kildare has been put out and lit again, because grief, it turns out, is not the last word where no breed is concerned. Continuance is. That is not a small thing to know. It is in fact everything. So take this book as it was meant, not as a summary to be filed away, but as a doorway left standing open. If you go no further than these 9 chapters, you have still met her. You have still knelt, in your own way, beside that dying chieftain and watched a woman explain eternity with what was lying on the floor. But if something in you is stirring, if you find yourself wanting to know more about the mother who bore her, the monastery she built stone by stone and rule by rule, the centuries of pilgrims who would not let her fire go dark, then daughter of the threshold, the church of the oak, and the flame that never went out, are waiting for you, and they will not disappoint the hunger this small book has, I hope, put in you. There is one more thing worth saying before we part, and it is not a scholarly point but a devotional one, so I will say it plainly, the way you would say it to family. Naam Brid has never asked to be admired from a distance. Every story the tradition has kept about her, every one of them, is a story about a woman who noticed who was in front of her and gave them exactly what they needed: fire for a dying man's fear, a cloak for a shivering kingdom, bread for hunger she could see with her own eyes. She was never interested in being marvelled at. She was interested in you having enough. That is still, today, what she is doing. It is what she was doing when someone first told you her name, and it is what she is doing now, closing this book in your hands. So light a candle for her, if you have one near. Weave a cross if the season is right and the rushes are handy, soaked soft, bent without much skill required, the way she would have wanted it, since she never once asked anyone to be an expert before they began. Say her name the old way, if you can. Ná Brid, Múr ná Gael, Mary of the Gael. Let the flame at Kildare, burning tonight exactly as it has burned across every century that tried to end her story, stand as your answer to whatever this world tells you about endings. She was born between two worlds and never stopped living in both at once: the seen and the unseen, the kitchen and the miracle, the poor woman at the door and the Christ she said was standing behind her. That is the whole of her secret, and now it is yours too. Go ré brid naufa I do cúdachta. May Holy Brigid go with you through this book's closing page and every threshold after it.